Good evening. My name is Sean Quimby. I'm Penn's Associate University Librarian for Special Collections and Director of the Kislak Center. It's my duty and my pleasure to welcome you to the second of this year's A.S.W. Rosenbach Lectures in Bibliography by Elizabeth McHenry toward a history of Black print. Last night, Professor McHenry charted the Black bibliographical landscape, calling attention to where traditional Eurocentric approaches to book history come up short, while at the same time revealing methods and sources that hold the potential to open new vistas in the field more generally. Her lecture set the stage for tonight, where she'll discuss W.E.B. Du Bois's printing venture in Memphis, and Thursday, when she will look at the role of historically Black colleges and universities played in defining African-American print culture. I want to take a moment to thank the Rosenbach Committee for inviting Professor McHenry to participate in the Rosenbach lectures, especially Lynn Farrington, who also serves as Senior Curator and Director of Programs at the Kislak Center. And of course, I want to thank you, the audience, for ensuring that the conversation that follows will be as rich and illuminating as the lecture itself. The material text community in and around Penn and Philadelphia is, as the saying goes, often imitated but never duplicated. All right, and now to introduce the introducer. Michael Winship is the Iris Howard Regents Professor of English Emeritus at the University of Texas at Austin. According to his CV, he has taught 10 different seminars at Rare Book School, from descriptive bibliography to the history of the book in America. Nearly 20 years ago, can it possibly be 20 years? I was a student in the latter course, and following Laura Helton's example from last night, I had hoped this evening to offer up a classic Winshipism from my class notes. But alas, I must offer a confession that will not instill much faith on your part in my ability to perform my day job. A failure of digital preservation on my part means that those notes reside on an ancient laptop that runs on now obsolete software and, for all practical purposes, are inaccessible. Some of what I learned in Professor Winship's class has faded from memory. But one thing that hasn't is the way he spoke of his work on volumes 7 through 9 of the Bibliography of American Literature, work that must have been intensive and at times grueling, but work that he was also deeply honored to have had the chance to perform. Indeed, I recall classmates talking with awe and a little bit of envy of what it must have been like to walk in those shoes, or not, as I seem to remember that he rarely wore them. To work with so many great books and in so many great libraries in order to produce a resource that would be truly foundational to the study of American literature. For us, BAL embodied an ethos that seemed increasingly endangered with the proliferation of iSchools, that the line between librarianship and scholarship, if it existed at all, was a permeable one. And I'll insert here that this same ethos is part of what helps make the material text community here at Penn thrive as it does. Professor Winship is the author and editor of 2 non-BAL monographs, 1995's American Literary Publishing in the Mid-19th Century, The Business of Ticknor and Fields, and 2008's The Industrial Book, 1840 to 1880, as well as numerous scholarly articles on the history of book production and distribution. And as the invitation to a 2020 Fetschrift at the Library Company of Philadelphia might have said, or did say, and said it well, Michael B. Winship is one of the world's most important bibliographers. So I will leave it at that and welcome him to the podium. Michael.
I never said that. Thank you, Sean. I'm both pleased and honored to introduce this evening's lecture by Elizabeth McHenry, the current Rosenbach Fellow in Bibliography. As Liz mentioned last night, we were long ago colleagues for a short time, 3 semesters only, in the English department at the University of Texas, before Liz moved on to her current institutional home at NYU. We were very sorry to see her leave Austin. Liz may not know, but this past weekend, I discovered that we share another scholarly distinction. We both published our first big academic articles in the Harvard Library Bulletin under the careful editorship of Ken Carpenter, whose quote unquote sound advice, as Liz acknowledges, has guided her writing ever since. I think it shows. Liz's Harvard Library Bulletin article entitled Dreaded Eloquence, The Origins and Rise of African American Literary Societies went on in revised and expanded form to make up the first chapter of her first book, Forgotten Readers, published in 2002. That book contributed to the study of American Black literary culture in very important ways. In her search for Black readers, she recovered and explored the history of African American literary societies and book clubs, thus broadening the field of Black studies, which at that time was largely focused on Black oral and vernacular cultures, by addressing important questions of Black literacy, both writing and reading. No longer could we restrict our understanding of early Black literacy to such signal moments as Frederick Douglass's struggles learning to read as a slave in Baltimore, or to the role of the freedmen schools in bringing literacy, limited as it may have been, to recently freed Blacks in the South after the Civil War. Nor could we any longer see the slave narrative as the sole major African-American writing and literary accomplishment of the 19th century. She showed us a richer, more complicated world of Black literary culture. If Forgotten Readers address Black literacy, Black reading and writing, Liz's next book, To Make Negro Literature, published in 2021, takes up questions of African American authorship. Again, Liz took us to unexpected but exciting places. We have chapters on W.H. Krogman's Progress of a Race, an extensive and weighty subscription book that chronicles the remarkable achievement of the Afro-American Negro. A chapter on bibliographical lists of books by Negro authors, prepared by Daniel Murray, the Library of Congress, and W.E.B. Du Bois. A chapter on T. Thomas Fortune's writings, published under the name Booker T. Washington. And on Mary Church Turrell's failure as an author, as documented in her correspondence, cover, and rejection letters with major monthly magazines. Liz's focus in this book on African-American literary culture at the turn of the 20th century was also original. This period, she argues, is worthy of, indeed requires, attention in its own right, and not just as the tail end of Reconstruction or the early beginnings of the Harlem Renaissance. We come away from that book with a new and expanded understanding of the practices and possibilities of African-American authorship. In last evening's lecture, Black Bibliography Here and Now, Liz gave us her thoughts on what it will take to construct, or better, reconstruct, African-American literary history. Reflecting on her own work, she explained how it intersected with and was shaped by early Black bibliographies and the principles of Black bibliographical practice. As a bibliographer myself, I'm gratified that, she claims, early in her career, she found an intellectual home in book history and bibliography, though I fear that not all were as welcoming as we should have been. I remember sitting with Liz at a sharp meeting. I think it must have been London in 2002, when she turned to me and asked, "Why am I the only person of color here?" Good question. The situation today is better, but it was and is a scandal how late bibliographers and book historians came to the game, came to recognize the place of African American in our literary culture. But the work is now ongoing. Last evening, Liz highlighted books by Brian Sincha and Laura Helton, both due out next month, as well as the American Antiquarian Society's Black Self-Publishing Project and the Black Bibliography Project, directed by Jackie Goldsby and Meredith McGill. It's a beginning, but much more, a great deal more work remains before us. In last evening's lecture, Liz also introduced us to the beginnings of her own new project, a project that will examine the history of Black printers and the business of Black printing. Having expanded our understanding of Black literacy and Black authorship with her first two books, Liz now promises to do the same with Black bookmaking as we move toward a more comprehensive history of Black print. Yesterday, she showed us photographs of the printing shops established at HBCUs for training Black students in the craft of printing. She showed us newspaper advertisements for the services of Black job printers located outside the major northern urban centers, and a weekly statement showing work performed and the weekly finances of the Memphis job printer, Edward L. Simon and Company. This last firm, established by W.E.B. Du Bois in 1903, will be the subject of this evening's lecture, which is entitled Black Literature and the Business of Printing. Please join me in welcoming the Rosenbach Fellow in Bibliography, Elizabeth McHenry.
Thank you all. Thank you for that. That was a great introduction. I feel like this is like the perfect walk down memory lane in all the good ways of more than I don't want to say how long, but a long time in the profession. So I'm delighted to be here, and let's get started. Tonight the title of the lecture is there it is, Black Literature and the Business of Printing. In early October of 1903, Howard University professor Kelly Miller wrote to W.E.B. Du Bois to communicate a well-considered idea. After much deliberation, he wrote, "I have about concluded that the time is ripe for the publication of a series of works on supplemental reading. Pamphlets of, say, 20 pages can be printed for about 1.5 cents on the basis of a 5,000 edition," Miller's letter continues, "with this concrete proposal. Suppose you, Dr. Lucy E. Moten, and myself should form a company with a capital of $500. This would enable us to print and advertise about 3 issues, by which time, with the proper pushing and working of public school officials, I believe the project could be made self-sustaining." He closes his letter by encouraging Du Bois to plan a trip to Washington, where he, Du Bois, and Moten, who was the principal of the minor normal school, which becomes Howard University, could have a conference on the scheme. 1 year later, Miller again contacted Du Bois, this time with a slightly different but not unrelated scheme in mind. Writing to Du Bois on Christmas Day, 1904, Miller advanced a plan that was more specific. "Dear Dr. Du Bois," he began, "on this Xmas Day, it occurs to me to write and inquire what has become of you. How about that publication plan? My notion in brief is that there should be published a library of Negro literature in 10-cent pamphlets after the fashion of the Humboldt Library of Scientific Literature, I figured that a capital of $1,000 would be sufficient to finance the venture. The scope of the topics is almost endless. The object being to bring together in compact body all the best and substantial things that have been said and done on this subject. As the matter now stands, such contributions lie scattered in books and pamphlets and magazines and newspaper articles. Original contributions, monographs, or treaties might also be included. He ended the letter with an effort to move this project along. Can we get together and take up this matter at once? I believed it would be a profitable venture, as well as a great contribution to available knowledge on this subject. The concern that Miller raises here, that Negro literature was scattered and needed to be both collected and made more widely available, is a familiar one in African American letters. It's precisely what animated past generations of scholars, writers, archivists, collectors, and librarians to develop practices through which to gather Black writing, both to preserve it and to ensure its accessibility. What's interesting here is Miller's attentiveness, his curiosity about exploring different print formats. He suggests that works of Negro literature could be repackaged in pamphlet form. 20 pages or so is what Kelly recommends, relaying this idea to Du Bois as a scheme. It's a word that Du Bois himself uses 6 years later, when around or just before 1910, he presented to the publishing board of the newly formed NAACP a proposed scheme of publication for the NAACP. We have on hand the following manuscripts, which seem to be worth publishing, he begins, listing 6 manuscripts, 1 by Kelly Miller and 2 authored by Du Bois himself. He imagines 2 ways these works and others like them might find an audience. The first is, and I quote, to publish these papers as separate pamphlets in editions of 500 to 2,000 each. If this is done, he suggests, the more important pamphlets should be electrotyped so as to make reprinting easy. The second option he proposes is to publish a monthly periodical beginning September 1st. This periodical would publish articles, but it would also be a digest of happenings and comments along the color line, arranged from clippings that would include notices of the work of the NAACP, as well as editorials. It would not replace the need for shorter, inexpensively produced formats of the pamphlet. Du Bois recommended that the leading articles in the periodical still be electrotyped and reprinted as a pamphlet, and that some of the editorials could be used as tracts and leaflets. This variety of print formats would allow the NAACP to draw on what Du Bois described as both the regular periodic attacks of the magazine with the skirmish tactics of the pamphlet and tract. No doubt swayed in large part by Du Bois's opinion, the publishing committee approved option 2, setting the stage for the creation of The Crisis. Described in the masthead as a record of the darker races that was intended to set forth those facts and arguments which show the danger of race prejudice, particularly as manifest today toward colored people. The first issue of The Crisis appeared in November of 1910. Arguably the most widely read and most influential periodical about race and social justice in U.S. history, the magazine was regularly published monthly and widely read, its circulation peaking at about 100,000 readers in 1919. Sharing the masthead with Du Bois was Kelly Miller, a partner in bringing The Crisis to life, as he had been in conceiving of the scheme to have the series of pamphlets published to create a library of Negro literature. Now, I open this lecture with these exchanges because in their mutual use of the word scheme, Du Bois and Miller unconsciously illuminate what is a common thread in African American literary history, the way literacy and print is associated with cunning, with calculations, and with plotting. So on the one hand, both Miller and Kelly use the word scheme in a purely innocent way, each to refer to the printing ideas they wish to put in motion. On the other, in the context of the long and complex history of Black writing, reading, literacy, and print, their use of the word scheme in connection with their efforts to put Black words and ideas into various forms of print evokes the word's other layers of meaning, including this definition from the Oxford English Dictionary: to lay schemes, to use ingenuity, resort to contrivance, to devise plans, especially underhanded or with sinister motive. This meaning of the word insists we remember the ingenuity, the will, and sometimes the secrecy and cunning that engaging with print has historically required for Black people, whether they wish to read it, write it, or have it printed, or to circulate it. To see this in history, one need only think back to the story of David Walker, and a used clothing salesman in Boston, who in 1829 sewed copies of his incendiary appeal to the colored citizens of the world into the clothing he sold to sailors in order to ensure the pamphlet's safe passage into the South, where it could be distributed to those that were its primary audience, the enslaved Black people Walker wished his writing to arouse and inspire. Correspondence from the beginning of the 20th century between Black intellectuals and race leaders about literary ventures and printing needs serves as a reminder that, in a time marked by the disintegration of civil rights won during Reconstruction, the legalization of segregation and the expansion of Jim Crow laws, and the rise of anti-Black violence and discrimination, printing and circulating Black knowledge remained subject to considerable discretion. But traces of these schemes remain as Black literary practitioners poured their energy into conceptualizing printing plans and theorizing how specific formats of print would best serve their various interests and reach different constituencies. Miller's suggestion that pamphlets of about 20 pages would be valuable in schools. Du Bois's impression that the NAA would likely need in its arsenal a variety of different kinds of print, a full-fledged magazine with all its contents, but also pamphlets, tracts, and leaflets as well. These are examples of their broad-ranging curiosity about print and their interest in the different modalities in which different printed attributes and forms of print might speak. In the projects they imagined lies important information about the urgency and care with which they calculated the efficacy of different print formats, their ideas about what literature was good for, and their experiments in how to get it into the hands of those they believed needed it most. The focus of this lecture is on one of these projects. Sometime in the summer or early fall of 1903, W.E.B. Du Bois quietly purchased an existing printing business at 163 Beale Street in Memphis, Tennessee, reopening it as the Ed L. Simon & Co. Printers. He did not live or work in Memphis, nor did he have experience in or knowledge of the printing business. Rather, he was a professor of sociology at Atlanta University, a job he took in 1897 and held until 1910 when he actually left to go and start the crisis. In theory, there were printing offices in Atlanta he might have turned to, and he also would have had access to the university's printing office. Described in the catalog of Atlanta University for the 1901-1902 year as large and well-appointed, the printing office was both a place of instruction where students learned the printing trade and a working job printing business for the larger Atlanta community. In addition to the two monthly papers it published, the Atlanta Bulletin and the student newspaper called The Scroll, the printing office housed the Atlanta University Press, which beginning in 1896 had produced the proceedings of the annual conference for the study of Negro problems, as well as related publications. And yet, rather than take advantage of this resource or another local Atlanta printer, Du Bois invested his entire life savings, some $1,600, in the Memphis printing business, entering into partnership with two recent Atlanta University graduates who had been his students and who had worked in the university's printing office. In this, Du Bois was the outsider of the group. And yet he was the driving force behind the venture, which promised him something that he did not have, but felt he sorely needed to do the work he most wanted to do: ready access to and control over a printing press. Was this the publication plan that Kelly Miller had asked about in his Christmas 1904 letter to Du Bois? I found little evidence to suggest that Du Bois widely shared the news of his foray into the printing business. He seems to have kept his plans close to the vest, discussing it minimally or only in the most general terms, even with others he knew to be interested in experiments and initiatives in Black print. This included not only Kelly Miller, but also the author Charles W. Chestnut, with whom Du Bois had exchanged letters in 1903 on the idea of what Chestnut described as a national Negro newspaper. Although both Chestnut and Du Bois shared a literary sensibility, their difference on the question of what exactly was needed in a Black newspaper is suggestive of one of the reasons Du Bois was not more open about his venture into the printing business. In his letter to Du Bois, Chestnut describes his impression of the kind of Black publications that were most needed in this way: what the Negro needs more than anything else is a medium through which he can present his case to thinking white people, who, after all, are the arbiters of our destiny. Chestnut's letter also offered a sense of his impression that Black audiences for Black print were immeasurably small and relatively inconsequential. How helpless the Negro is in the South, your own writing gives ample proof, Chestnut wrote to Du Bois, most likely referring to Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk, which had recently been published. While in the North, he continued, he's so vastly in the minority in numbers, to say nothing of his average humble conditions, that his influence alone would be inconsiderable. There were already a number of Negro papers, Chestnut observed, but he said, I fear few white people read the present newspapers published by colored people. Chestnut's perspective suggests the extent to which the two men's vision of what was sorely needed diverged, and lends important context to Du Bois's Memphis venture into the printing business. Most significantly, Chestnut saw white people as a Black newspaper's primary audience. Du Bois's printing business was differently conceived. He saw it as a way to create more and better literary opportunities for African Americans, while also making the materials of literary study more accessible to them. The job printing business, he would explain in a document seeking funding for the journal he conceived as one of the many products of the printing business, would be the basis of a publishing house. Du Bois calculated that job printing was the means of supporting a purposeful printing operation. Out of the business once established, he speculated, could grow various enterprises: supplementary reading for Negro schools, textbooks, works of Negro authors, etc. In the face of Black people's exclusion from adequate schooling and from bookstores and public libraries, and given the exclusion of their words and their histories from resources like textbooks, establishing a printing business could persuade Black communities of the sort of print materials could provide Black communities with the sort of print materials they most needed to both educate and entertain themselves. One thing this document shows is the extent to which Du Bois was interested in access to print. Augmenting available print resources for African Americans would supplement the insufficient materials they received. But also articulated in Du Bois's aspirations for the printing business was a desire to give voice to Negro writers and artists, who Du Bois understood to be stunted by efforts to censor their words, alter their messages, or otherwise silence them. A Negro-owned, Negro-operated, and Negro-directed printer, and eventually full-fledged publishing house, would value Black writing differently than would a white-owned publishing business. In a Black-owned and operated printing business, Black authors, and I quote here, could be encouraged to write of themselves and depict things nearest to them, and thus to write and speak more naturally and effectively than they usually do. Owning the means of representing Black print meant that Du Bois could use the business to forward racially progressive print endeavors and to nurture Black voices toward an honesty and a boldness that was lacking in African American writing. It's true that Du Bois himself had found a lot of success in finding publishers for his academic work. His dissertation, for instance, was published as the first volume of the Harvard Historical Studies series in 1896, and his sociological study, The Philadelphia Negro, which was published in 1899, was issued for the University of Pennsylvania, which had sponsored the project. He had been approached by the publisher A.C. McLurg about publishing The Souls of Black Folk, a book that grew out of what he would call his fugitive pieces, by which he meant a number of previously published articles that had appeared in the Atlantic Monthly and various other journals. And yet he knew the difficulty Black writers faced as they tried to get their writing into print. He knew from experience that writing he submitted for publication faced unacceptable delays in the publication process, whether from lack of support or lack of finances. There would also be times that it was willfully lost, just never published, with no explanation. He recognized that even his writing was monitored for its acceptability, his words and ideas edited or amended to make them palatable to readers easily offended as much by the idea of African-American knowledge as by the words in which it was demonstrated. This had happened when he was working on many of his publications, including The Souls of Black Folk. Correspondence indicates that Du Bois had significant freedom in the design of that book. But even so, it reveals the ways he had to wrestle with its editor, who from time to time admitted to taking the liberty of toning down a too strong word or phrase, which, while justified, might unduly prejudice those we want to read and learn from your book. There were other times when his writing emerged from the editing process so cut up and mangled, he refused to claim it as his own. I cannot, of course, have my name signed to anything that is not substantially my work and my opinions, he wrote angrily in response to one such situation. I want it understood that any proof I receive will be overhauled until it expresses my views and not someone else's. These interventions in Black writing were something Du Bois would not tolerate and that Black writers could not afford. And this understanding was clearly manifest in his decision to buy the printing business in 1903. But even before this, Du Bois held commitments that were aligned with an interest in specifically Black print. It's notable that whereas Du Bois was actively involved in the Fisk Herald, a student newspaper at Fisk University that he wrote for and for which he served as editor-in-chief as he earned his first undergraduate degree, he doesn't appear to have submitted anything for publication to Harvard student newspapers while he was completing his second undergraduate degree there. On the contrary, it was during these years that Du Bois became more and more involved in intellectual activities that took place outside of the university setting. He grew especially active in Boston's Black intellectual community. In the spring of 1891, he delivered a lecture titled, "Does Education Pay?" before the Colored National League. Du Bois had seen his words in print before, but he nevertheless carefully and painstakingly cut a printed copy of the lecture out of a newspaper, probably from the Courant, a Black weekly newspaper published in Boston, pasting it together with the handwritten version from which he initially gave the lecture in a way that suggests he was still struck by seeing the movement of his words and ideas from handwriting into print. This was one way to linger over the difference between handwriting and print, or perhaps more accurately, its continuity, to make visual the ways that ideas became formalized in print and printed items took on a certain authority, one that could travel and that had the potential to communicate to broad audiences. That he deemed this early manuscript turned printed article worthy of being edited and saved gives some indication of the value Du Bois placed on the look of printedness, which into the 20th century and in African-American contexts was still located in the authority of a printer. It was during this time that he first sketched out the details of a periodical developed specifically for the Black community. This sketch of a journal he called The Black Book is from around 1890, the year he finished his second undergraduate degree at Harvard. The Black Book, he wrote, would be devoted to the interests of the Negro race, and he would be its editor and publisher. The details of this publication, as he imagines them, it was to be a book, say 6 by 6, 16 or 24 pages, printed on heavy paper with uncut edges and special font or type, indicate just how early in his career he was attuned to the range of material attributes that went into print, decisions that were part of his thinking in culturally specific ways about what might affect what Jonathan Stern has described as the look, feel, experience, and workings of media. One thing to emphasize here is his use of the Black Book as a title. In doing so, he claims the book as something that serves Black concerns, naming it as a particular type of public space that aimed to offer a privacy for the ideal Black reader, as Margot Natalie Crawford has argued about the use of the Black Book as a title during the Black arts movement. How should it be packaged? The interest Du Bois shows here in type or print graphics is noteworthy. It's one more example of the kind of details that mattered. We might connect this to the later decision he and his students made as they prepared data visualizations of their studies of Black life in Georgia and in the United States in preparation for the 1900 Paris Exposition. Du Bois used hand-drawn geometric capitals to label many of the charts and graphs, a bold style that was both easy to learn for Du Bois's students and easily accessible for those viewing the posters. But this kind of lettering was not yet popular in 1900, nor was it the kind of typeface, should it have been translated into typeface, nor was it a typeface that was popular, the sans serif. Sans serif typefaces wouldn't be popular until the 1920s or 30s, when their clean, chunky design would become widely associated with the modern. Du Bois's use of this geometric type in 1900 then is an example of the way he claimed design and the visual as crucial modes of communication. His pioneering innovation has been recognized by present-day type designer Trey Seals, whose firm, Vocal Type, is inspired by the history of civil rights activism. They recently introduced a Du Bois type family, which is a tribute to Du Bois's activism based on Seals's interest in racial expression and his study of the block letters Du Bois used in the Paris Exposition infographics series. So in this context, Du Bois's venture into the business of printing appears as the culmination of a long-standing interest in print and its possibilities. The cost of purchasing W.J. Yerby's existing printing business in 1903 was $250. Du Bois immediately found that to get the office up and running as a profitable job printing business, they would need to upgrade their equipment. Among other things, they purchased new type for $559, a new electric motor, $55, and a new perforation machine for $25. Their most expensive investment was a Whitlock cylinder press, which they purchased for $1,650. This was a cutting-edge machine, advertised widely in 1902 as a necessary feature of the modern press room of an up-to-date enterprising printing plant. The purchase required a loan of $1,000, but it would place the Ed.L. Simon and Company in a position to turn out high-quality, high-volume printing, such as that necessary for newspaper work. What's evident from the equipment that they purchased was that the printing business was not only about creating a newspaper. Included in the list of what they bought is a job press, which cost them only $45 in exchange, which means they traded it for probably outdated equipment. This press measured 7 by 11, which would make it capable of printing items that were just smaller than our standard piece of paper. This included a world of printed items, including posters, cards, stationery, invitation, and programs. One might imagine that the purchase of a relatively small job printing press might stand in contrast to the proprietor's desire to invest in new and state-of-the-art equipment. But each machine spoke to the different sort of jobs that Du Bois needed to be prepared to do to ensure the success of the business and to meet his own goals. A small job press was indicative of the sort of small jobs and print runs that small local printers were asked to do at the beginning of the 20th century. The fact that the cylinder press was not installed in the printing office until the end of 1904 helps make visible the importance of the more modest technology of the job press. The office seems to have gotten off to a good start in its business. Its success without the high cylinder press suggests the importance of job printing in Memphis at the beginning of the 20th century. In November 1904, Du Bois reported on the receipts for local job work for the first 8 months of the business operation. From April to November, the printing shop had brought in a total of $1,343. Tallies of earnings for each month suggest that the printing business maintained a relatively steady stream of work. The highest amount earned was $238 in June of 1904. The lowest was $96, which was the total amount earned on printing jobs in September of 1904. Du Bois was optimistic that the installation of the cylinder press in November of 1904 would increase the business's profits, and he fully expected the job work to pay for the cylinder press within a year or 18 months. One of the most important things that Du Bois did with his printing press is experiment with different print formats as a means of creating different kinds of texts aimed at different Black audiences and different kinds of readers. Du Bois shared Kelly Miller's longstanding interest in pamphlets, and this is one example of the kind of text he expressed interest in using in their printing, interest in their printing office doing. Early on in their partnership, he wrote to Edward Simon to ask him about the feasibility of printing pamphlets. Sending him an example of the kind of pamphlet he envisioned, Du Bois asked, "What's the cheapest rate per page we could handle a bound pamphlet like this? Printing it on good paper in clear, readable type." Du Bois's inquiry about an edition from 500 to 1,000 at first and increasing, his instructions that Electrotype plates be used as reprints would be needed, all speak to Du Bois's growing knowledge of the printing business. They also speak to his eagerness to use the press to experiment with print and to the decisions he was engaged in making that envisioned what a printed text would look like in its final form and how it would circulate. One of his most important experiments was with his own prose poem, Credo. Credo was an unusual publication in that it stands at some distance from the sort of highly intellectual and academic writing Du Bois was primarily known for at the beginning of the 20th century. Importantly, it steps away from the distance stance he assumes at the beginning of The Souls of Black Folk, where he makes clear that the glimpse behind the veil he provides for his gentle readers is a means of educating white people on the lives and strivings of African Americans. Du Bois clearly identifies himself as African American in that text, something he no doubt deemed necessary because of the educated manner in which he wrote, but he nevertheless remains distanced from the life behind the veil, as if positioning himself as an intermediary figure between Black and white worlds. Written in the first person, Credo reads very differently. It is an intimate prayer or creed spoken by a mature and coherent Black voice that unabashedly claims pride of race and lineage and self. In his biography of Du Bois, David Levering Lewis claims that Credo, and I quote here, was meant to serve a dual purpose, a manifesto to a few thousand influential whites outlining the social and civil rights ideals Du Bois and his supporters embodied, and catechism for great numbers of ordinary men and women of his race whose beleaguered pride was faltering. But the insistent eye of Credo that dominates and reverberates through the piece certainly makes it resonate more profoundly with African Americans, the great majority of whom would not have knowledge of or access to it in the Independent, where it was first published. The poem was meant for them and had the potential to produce a Black subjectivity that could become an agent of social and cultural change in the United States. So letters congratulating Du Bois for his achievement confirm that Credo had indeed received wide readership in the Independent, including by African Americans in the leadership class. It was also reprinted in many different publication venues, a fact that was underscored by one reader, the emigrationist, missionary, and Episcopal Bishop James Theodore Hawley, who, writing from Port-au-Prince, Haiti, on December 3rd, 1904, cited at least two other publications two publications other than the Independent where he knew Credo to have been reproduced. The Literary Digest of New York was one of them, and that's this one. And the Recorder of the recorder of Indianapolis, Indiana. But even the reprinting of the poem in these journals, Black leaders recognized, would not diversify its audience in the way that would make the poem accessible to African Americans en masse. Ideas for how to do so came unsolicited from Black educator and activist Adela Hunt Logan, who taught English and the social sciences at Tuskegee. She was also the school's first librarian and so successful at stocking the library with whatever she could that was written by, for, or about people of African ancestry that in the year 1900, when Booker T. Washington appealed to Andrew Carnegie for funds to construct a freestanding library, he would boast that their existing library already had a foundation of 12,000 books and periodicals and other forms of print. She wrote to Du Bois just 4 days after the poem's publication in The Independent. Your credo in the current issue of The Independent is what I call a classical jewel, she told him. Do please have it printed on a good hanging card and let us distribute it for the edification of souls. Du Bois set about reproducing credo in this different, more widely accessible form immediately. The project was underway, but not yet completed when Du Bois wrote to Simon in the final days of 1904, opening his letter with, "Am awaiting credo with interest." The result was a broadside version of the text that would be appreciated by a wider and more to the point, a different audience than that reached by The Independent. As printed in The Independent, credo is wedged between two long articles. It shares a page with the end of an article on creative farming and is followed by one titled A Clearinghouse of the Sciences. Aligned with these texts in terms of typeface and layout, there's nothing about the way credo is printed in The Independent that speaks to its deep meaning or the profundity of its vision. This is, however, captured in the two-color broadside version of credo, which bears the inscription at the bottom, written at Atlanta University, first printed in the New York Independent, now printed by Ed L. Simon & Co., Memphis, Tennessee. At 20 centimeters by 25 centimeters, or just under 8 by 10, credo is slightly smaller than a standard piece of paper. Its typography, including the decorative red border in which it is framed, is a key feature of the way it is presented for appreciation to its viewer. By distinguishing the poem from what surrounds it, the frame invites the reader into the new environment that the words create. In this case, that environment is one where Black life is valued and respected rather than disparaged. Like a work of art hanging in a gallery or an illuminated manuscript, credo's red frame gives the poem presence, elevating and enhancing without overpowering it. The first phrase of each stanza has been printed in red ink for emphasis. This gives credo the effect of being two poems. The first is composed by combining only the highlighted red lines, which succinctly communicate a set of absolute truths, while the second, longer one elaborates on them. The text is also distinguished by its patterned embellishment with florons, stylized typographical ornaments usually resembling flowers or leaves that are used by printers to divide paragraphs or trains of thought, or to fill in unsightly blank spaces. Unlike the plain, cramped type of credo in The Independent, the Ed L. Simon & Co. printed broadside version uses a larger but more delicate, more decorative, and more inviting typeface. It looks special, its importance emphasized by the ornamental qualities of the document itself. These and other visual structures of the text are not simply aesthetic. They convey information that contributes to and enhances the poem's meaning. In this form, credo works verbally and visually to honor its African-American subjects and the ideals by which they live. This version of credo is a reminder that printed texts are not only about those who get to speak, they're also about who gets to listen. As a broadside, credo would have appealed to the souls that Logan refers to in her note to Du Bois, the Black folk whose humanity Du Bois had so richly illuminated in the pages of The Souls of Black Folk. We do well to remember that while Du Bois chafed against the restrictions placed on him in the Jim Crow South and considered the North the site of more opportunities for African Americans in terms of what he described as learning and culture, he saw the South, and specifically the Black Belt, as the center and starting point of the Negro problems. His commitment to this region and its people was his greatest preoccupation, and those are his words, across the first decade of the 20th century. At the very moment he was working on the broadside version of Credo, he was also working on a proposal for a social and economic study of the working conditions in Loudoun County, Alabama. Like the rural population of Macon County, where Tuskegee was located, this population was unlikely to know of or read The Independent. Indeed, Credo was unlikely to reach them at all unless a concerted effort was made to reformat and reprint it and to distribute it by hand, either free of charge, as Logan suggests she and her like-minded colleagues would do in the vicinity of Tuskegee, or at a nominal price. The printed broadside was also more likely to be legible and find use among people with varying degrees of literacy than the text as it appears in The Independent. Although the entire prose poem may have appeared intimidating to those readers, the highlighted first lines could easily be committed to memory, to cohere and be orally recited like a prayer. Credo was, in fact, an affirmation of faith and a reminder of the daily principles by which African Americans should live. We might be wise to think of Credo in the way that Du Bois printed it, as having more of an audience than a readership, as Meredith McGill suggests might be true of pamphlets and similar print formats generally. The lyrical quality of the text and its oral and performative potential was accentuated by the very layout of the broadside version of Credo, inviting it to be performed as a site of literary community at family, civic, or religious gatherings. By printing it separately as an attractive broadside that could be owned, displayed, and used, Du Bois illustrated one reason he wanted to have a printing venue under his control. As a single sheet, Credo would make visible Black intellectual work and cultural practice in a way that reached more deeply into the Black community than would an expensive book or even a journal. Printing it was a way of spreading print and its influence more deeply into and more broadly throughout the Black community. This effect was not lost on those who understood the importance of Du Bois's mission. In a letter from January of 1905, Francis Grimke noted just that. He thanked Du Bois for sending him a copy of the printed broadside Credo. I read it, of course, he said, when it first appeared in The Independent, and was delighted with it, he told Du Bois. But he would go on to say, I'm glad it has been put in this form of a broadside for general circulation, where it can be hung in the homes of the people. It ought to be hung in all of our homes and in all of our schoolhouses. Grimke was right to note that while middle and upper class African Americans like himself were likely to have seen in the text in its original context, neither its placement in that publication nor its format there would ensure the poem's widest circulation. Without a broadside edition, Du Bois's text and its religiously rooted philosophy of racial pride and equality would not have entered the homes and the consciousness of African Americans, particularly in the Deep South. Du Bois has generally been portrayed as an elitist who at the beginning of the 20th century was particularly isolated from the folk as a university professor. But his Memphis printing venture is a representative of his determination to mobilize forms of print, and with it, ideas about race and social justice beyond the talented 10th. His printing business would be sustained by small and mundane printing jobs that served Memphis's local Black community. But Du Bois's aspiration was that it would in turn support the distribution of more significant texts about race pride and civil and human rights that had the potential to reach far into the Black Belt for those, for instance, who lived in rural Alabama. By controlling his own printing press, Du Bois could ensure that a text like Credo made its way into the Black communities that so desperately needed positive representations and affirmations of Blackness. Although I found no evidence of similar printing projects completed by the Ed L. Simon and Company, Du Bois's archives include a number of documents that may have served as prototypes for other experiments in single sheet or few sheet printing that would have complemented the broadside version of Credo. One prime example of this is the document he created with scissors and paste that combines only the songs and the poems that open each of the chapters of Souls of Black Folk. By isolating these excerpts of Anglo-European verse and bars of music from Black spirituals, he advances a different but no less lyrical way to experience the souls of Black folk. The composition of the text itself proposes different sites and forms of literary interaction. This effort to reformat existing print in ways that might expand Black literature's audibility and its audience is reminiscent of Langston Hughes's efforts in the 1930s to do something similar with broadsides and booklets he developed as part of the Golden Stair Press. At readings in schools, churches, and community centers, Hughes would sell a booklet version of 6 of his poems, suitable for reading aloud or for recitations at schools, churches, and lodges, etc., for 25 cents. He also sold illustrated broadsides of a single poem for 10 cents each. He recognized that Black writing would not reach what he described as the masses of the Negro people if it were not produced in forms that were within their financial reach and that modeled their potential uses. The pamphlet and broadside versions of his poetry were specifically geared towards presenting his poetry for recitation and performance in a way that would make them meaningful for a wide range of people with different reading competencies, including those who might struggle to read the text for themselves. Like Du Bois, Hughes envisioned the creation of a Black public that imagined itself through literary expression. As an easily printed single sheet, the broadside form of Credo, printed by the Ed.L. Simon and Company, is one example of the kind of Black print, unbound, that deserves further examination by scholars of African-American literary history. Here I echo the title of Eric Gardner's monumental 2015 study of the Christian Recorder, which illustrates the importance of expanding our view of African-American print culture to include newspapers, periodicals, and other understudied forms of print that were distributed in various Black communities. By unbound, Gardner refers specifically to newspapers and periodicals that were crucial sites of reading and publication for African Americans. I take that word even more literally to draw our attention to literary works like Credo that were printed and distributed as a single sheet. Scholars of Black print culture have expanded our focus. Scholars of Black print culture have expanded our focus to include a variety of successful, sustained serial print productions that had relatively large distributions and readerships. We have paid far less attention to the history of print materials like Credo. These will be, of course, far more difficult to study. As single sheets of paper, small hanging cards, or even loosely bound pamphlets, they were far more delicate and more susceptible to damage, not to mention ordinary wear and tear, than bound books or even unbound newspapers and periodicals. Unprotected by bindings and covers, broadsides like Credo, like most products of small printing businesses at the turn from the 19th to the 20th century, were not intended to last forever. Rather, they were meant for immediate use, and this use, they were passed around by hand, read, displayed in all of our homes and in all of our schoolhouses, as Grimke says, simply wore them out. So the goal of this project was initially to move on to a different printing business or printing situation in hopes of considering a variety of Black printing businesses on the way to writing a true history of Black printers. But what consumes me now is a slightly different line of inquiry. What if I could follow this one fragile document, Credo, as it left the printer's office on Beale Street in Memphis and traveled first to the local post office and then through the mail to Tuskegee, Alabama? Could I find Credo again in Alabama as Adela Hunt Logan received it, to see what she did with it, how and where it was distributed, and how it was received and used by those souls that Logan saw as in need of edification? I'm not without clues as to Credo's trajectory. Alongside Booker T. Washington's wife, Margaret Washington, Logan was a founding member of the Tuskegee Women's Club, a group made up of women on the Tuskegee faculty and the wives of male faculty members. Outreach to the Tuskegee community was central to their mission, and one of their most significant projects was the founding of the Elizabeth Russell Settlement in 1897. The settlement was located in Macon County, about 8 miles from Tuskegee, and it was estimated to include about 75 families living on some 1,500 acres of land, 1,000 of which were planted with cotton each year. It was composed largely of tenants who farmed the famously rich soil of the Black Belt. This is, Imani Perry has observed, a region of double meaning, named for rich soil and the poorest people, slaves and later the barely emancipated Black sharecroppers and convicts leased out to do the hellish work of clearing the land. This is an accurate reflection on those that lived on the Elizabeth Russell settlement in 1904. Thrust into self-reliance almost completely without resources in the aftermath of slavery, this community suffered from poverty, peonage, soil depletion, and substandard living conditions. It's likely to have been the community Logan had in mind when she wrote to Du Bois asking him to have Credo put on a good hanging card to be distributed in the environs of Tuskegee for the edification of souls. In an ideal world, I would be able to document the processes of collaboration through which Credo was circulated, not within the relatively privileged space of Tuskegee Institute itself, but amidst a rural population grounded in agricultural work in Macon County, Alabama. This might take the form of a comment about Credo in the minutes of the Tuskegee Women's Club, or a thank you note from Logan to Du Bois telling him of Credo's distribution or its impact. In a really, really ideal world, I might find some indication of Credo's reception and use, like a story about its recitation or some mention of the way it was hung on the wall of a Sunday school classroom. With so many print records at my disposal, what I wish for, in other words, and what I lack is a paper trail. I'm left with a meager record of the general work of the Tuskegee Women's Club, which will be the basis for further research and much, much more looking. In addition to their settlement work, the Tuskegee Women's Club maintained a school for women and children, as well as a Sunday school in the town of Tuskegee. And according to one description of their activities, community meetings offered the opportunity for neighborhood self-expression. They created a small lending library and also collected pictures for the walls of the room in which they met. From the club's inception, they also helped to organize day and night schools, as well as Sunday schools in the local Black communities around the Tuskegee area. They laid great stress on the teaching of Negro history in all the night and day schools in Macon County. They took interest in men who have, this is a quote, they took interest in men who have had to live parts of their lives in jail here in the county, to quote Mary Margaret Washington's phrasing. In addition to helping them locate their families, Washington notes that papers have been distributed to these men, books have been given to them. All these might have been opportunities for Credo to be circulated, read, and displayed and put to use, providing with an audience or viewership, if not a readership. It's also notable that club women were constantly gathering papers and books, some of which were donated to local schools and reading rooms. They also claim to have distributed thousands of papers so that the cracks of the cabin homes may be closed against the wind, and in order that the children may be accustomed to seeing something besides cheerless logs that usually face them inside their homes. What's described here is perhaps most effectively visualized in this photograph, captioned by the staff at the Library of Congress as simply African-American couple sitting in one-room cabin near fireplace. It was taken by George Cook, who around 1900 was working mostly in rural areas outside of Richmond, Virginia. This is not from rural Alabama. And yet it captures uses of print consistent with the thousands of papers Tuskegee Black Women's Club women claim to have distributed. Some of the uses of these printed papers were certain to have been functional. As the club women themselves describe, paper was used as insulation against the weather, which invaded log cabins and other hastily erected structures through small cracks and openings. But some used the print paper. Some use of the print paper they distributed is likely to have been different. In the context of homes in the Appalachia region of Eastern Kentucky, the historian Charles E. Martin has documented the ways that print used as wall covering, functioned in that region well into the 20th century. Calling the papering of interior walls with print media like newspapers, catalogs, or magazines, or any combination of all of the three, the most far-reaching decorative method of homes in the region, he describes print on the walls of these cabins to be both decorative and educational. One informant in his study described selecting Norman Rockwell covers from the Saturday Evening Post to paper the walls of her home because once assembled there, these kind of told a little story, which her small children who had not yet learned to read could appreciate. Martin documents the way that some people placed cartoons and Sunday funnies along the lower walls at about eye level for the smaller children, who were then able to move around the room looking at one after another. Two of his informants told him how they learned to spell Cincinnati from the wall, and others told of games they devised to teach children the alphabet or colors, or to teach them about different subjects from the print on the wall. Other informants spoke specifically about pasting poems where they could see or read them while they worked, and learning to recite them right off the wall, sometimes in partnership with other family members. These stories come from a different context, but they offer some perspective on how Credo might have been received in the Black Belts of rural Alabama, how it might have been considered, and how it might have been used. Print in these cases has practical use, but it's also an insistence on Black humanity's needs, one of which is sustained by something besides the cheerless logs. What we see in this photograph is akin to the kinds of decoration Zora Neale Hurston makes note of in her 1937 essay, Characteristics of Negro Expression, when she writes, "On the walls of the homes of the average Negro, one always finds a glut of gaudy calendars, wall pockets, and advertising lithographs. He sees the beauty in spite of the declaration of the Portland Cement Works or the butcher's announcement. I saw in mobile a room in which there was an overstuffed mohair living room suite, an invitation mahogany bed and chiffon robe, a console Victrola. The walls were gaily papered with Sunday supplements from the Mobile Register. There were 7 calendars and 3 wall pockets. One of these was decorated with a lace doily. The mantel shelf was covered with a scarf of deep homemade lace, looped up with a huge bow of pink crepe paper. Over the door was a huge lithograph showing the Treaty of Versailles being signed with a Waterman fountain pen. It was grotesque, yes," Hurston writes, but it indicated a desire for beauty. Decorating a decoration, as in the case of the doily on the gaudy wall pocket, did not seem out of place to the hostess. That feeling back of such an act is that there can never be enough of beauty, let alone too much. Writing in 1937, Howard University professor of English Benjamin Brawley makes a similar observation. If one has taken note of the homes of Negro peasants in the South, he must have observed that the instinct for beauty insists upon an outlet. If no better picture is available, there will be a flaming advertisement on the walls. So my talk ends tonight not with a printer, but with a world of print. In addition to the Black homes described here, remember that Black club women made it their mission to fill Sunday school rooms, railroad station waiting rooms, and yes, even Black penitentiaries with print. This suggestion of abundance is likely to call into question some of our most deeply held assumptions about what was available to Black readers in the rural South, pushing us to embrace the importance of looking more closely at the nature and the meaning of Black print culture in places we have not imagined or associated with literary history. It's important to note that rather than the books and bookshelves we are most accustomed to imagining in the parlors of the urban north, the forms of print that populate the landscapes of the Black South seem to be those that can be readily posted or affixed to the wall. These will reveal not only different genres, but also different networks of literary practice, different uses of literature, different models of reading, and different ways that printed texts were associated with mobility, all of which will help us grope our way back toward a better understanding of our ancestors' intellectual, emotional, and ethical investment in paper, in print. As I said at the outset of my lectures, these print materials will be difficult to recover, let alone study and contextualize. But they will help us to respond to the imperative of recovering African American history and African-American literary history in all its complexity, in all its locales, and for all its people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liz. We're going to give you one of these, or you want to give her that one? Sean's got the other one. Yeah. There we
Hello,
go.
hello, hello.
Hi. And we can take questions now from the audience.
Thank you so much for the second exciting lecture. I was thinking about something you said last night that was intriguing about the possibilities of working bibliographically to find experimentation, right, in Black print culture. And so I was following that idea through tonight. And one way would be, as you showed us, to trace a work like Credo across formats, right? And then another way would be to try to take a printer, right, and find the evidence of all that was being printed, including job work, right, or blanks. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about your efforts to try to find other artifacts of the Ed.L. Simon company, and if that seems possible and what that might entail. Yeah.
Yeah. So the most significant other artifact of that company is Du Bois's newspaper, The Moon, which has a very, very short print run, as do many African-American newspapers. It runs from about the end of 1905 through the summer of 1906. And I think there are 3 extant copies, one of which is in print, so it's easy to get your hands on. So that newspaper, in many ways, it has been treated very much like the period in which I work. People have looked at it only as a precursor to his later newspapers. And I think that newspaper is one of the things that that sort of demands we go back. Within that newspaper, in fact, are things like advertisements for what the Ed.L. Simon and Company published. And one thing that's interesting is that one thing I can't talk about today, but what happens to this printing office is that everything falls apart. These young printers he's working with are pretty much left holding the bag as Du Bois, flits around and does all this other stuff. I mean, if you think about those years, the Niagara Project, so much of his work, his project in Alabama, takes him away from Atlanta, much less stopping in Memphis to support these printers. So the printing office actually falls apart, but it gets passed on to someone who is called the finest female printer in all of Memphis. So it actually has a really interesting story, which I haven't been able to trace much further than that. But I think the key is, to go to Memphis and start looking in a lot of random places. I mean, not just the repositories, but also, let's say basically like the contents of someone's house. In other words, to look for things that were saved, but not necessarily saved in the context of an official repository. To get a sense of and also I would argue to look at certain kinds of like job printing documents that we know Black people used. Funeral programs. That's a huge source of Black print. And I think, even just to trace out, possibly that would happen like through a Black undertaker's office, but just to trace out even, the frequency with which that was what they were asked to do. If you look at the sales numbers, one thing they advertise doing is graduation announcements. So it'd be really interesting to go back, through probably the documents of the schools and try and figure out whether, what kinds of schools might have had either families that had graduation announcements or in some way. So, I think it's a process of imagining the kinds of products that might have come from that firm, and then trying to imagine, where they might have survived. And so, like when I mention undertakers and funeral homes. And I mean, that's one of the places people save that stuff more often than you would even imagine. And so I think that like that's one of the that's one of the areas I think that could be profitable. But I think that's a really, I mean, that kind of, I think the trick of this project is to figure out how many ways can you cut what you're trying to do. And so, one way is follow a document. One way is to stay with the printer and figure out, so, what are we talking about here? And, I think that one of the things that I'm like the first to acknowledge is that like, and I said it, I think yesterday, any project that has Du Bois in it is not a normal, it's not like your average project. So in some ways, this is like an artificial, it's starting with this incredible document, Credo. But it suggests some of the possibilities of like local printers.
I have a question from our Zoom audience from Phil Sinateri. He said, to what extent do you think Du Bois's efforts as a printer informed his work as editor of the Crisis magazine and perhaps later in his life, the journal Phylon? In other words, to what extent do you think his identities as a printer and editor commingled, and how did they shape his concern with visual presentation, lettering, page design and layout, etc., of the magazines and journals he edited?
So, that what I talked about relatively early in my talk tonight about when, for instance, when Du Bois was at Harvard and he was playing with print, like it literally playing with it, like cutting and pasting. I mean, for me, that was like a remarkable discovery. And to see the way that he, cut up Souls of Black Folk in order to sort of reimagine it. So, I don't think I would have said this, 2 months ago, but I think my sense is that he was attuned to this stuff incredibly early. And even that proposal for the Black Book, where he's already thinking about the quality of the paper, the layout, the size, when he says about something good type, right, as opposed to some other kind of type, bad type, I think that's pretty clear evidence that he has been thinking about these qualities of printing. Now, the question though is in some ways about his journalistic career that then follows. And I think that, his perceptiveness as he moves from imagining a journal like the Black Book, right, which he doesn't do, to buying this printing plant and imagining all these different kinds of publications, shapes, sizes, purposes, audiences, and moves through, in fact, not one, the Moon, but two early journals, Horizon, and then starts the Crisis. In some ways, it seems to me that he is building on this energy around printing and print and the possibilities of print. Like, what can it do? And in some ways, it's a fascinating story that I don't actually think ends. In other words, my answer to the question is that, yes, I think that he builds on this. And even, we see him also obviously experimenting in other ways, right? He experiments with fiction. He experiments with poetry. He experiments with all sorts of different kinds of writing. And this doesn't stop in his career, right? It continues. He experiments with encyclopedic writing. So I think it has everything to do with a certain awareness of the qualities of print and the possibilities of print, right? So these are two different things, right? One is like the details of the printing process or even what print can do. And the other is this awareness of like the impact of print on different kinds of audiences, which I think he's so sensitive to.
I have a question. Oh, thank you. Actually, that answer gave me a very deep question because I was just wondering, what was Du Bois's relationship, or if you came across his relationship with his workers and the people who actually produced the supplies his print shop used? Because I'm thinking of he is such an academic. He has all these amazing, he's traveling, doing all these amazing like projects. And even though he worked with those students, it's very labor intensive. Printing is very hard, heavy work, very like what we consider just like middle, lower class work. And you even think of like, at that time, I'm not sure exactly what the paper context was, if it was cotton or even you go back farther, like it's flax. So thinking about the weight of the paper, where he got the paper, like what was his relationship with the suppliers? Were there Black suppliers that he worked with for ink and paper? Like what,
Yeah.
did you learn anything about that in your research?
I don't have any sense of that, of like the suppliers who would bring in then the reams of paper, et cetera. What I do have is a sense of his relationship even with the two men who ended up running the printing office. And that gives me, I mean, that gives me a sense that Du Bois did not have a relationship with the suppliers for the business. But that he counted on these young men who in some ways were in over their heads in terms of all this stuff. And I think in some ways they were doing that heavy lifting. There's actually descriptions of one of the young men by a third party 10 years later, the memory of him hauling, print to the post office. And the description is painful to read even. But I don't have a sense of his relationship or who they would have been, who those players would have been. That's like, it's so funny because when I first started this, I was like, this is so cool. I mean, I'm so taken with this story. And I was like, I wonder if you could write a whole book around, this printing venture and to try and get at the fabric of, especially if you put it in the context of the larger context of printing in the state of Tennessee, which was exploding around this time in Black contexts. And in fact, someone once asked me, well, why did he choose Memphis? Because Nashville was the center of print. So there's so much interesting like layers. And I think that's like, that would be a chapter, right? That would be a chapter to think about like all the, like, how did this work? Like, technically.
I have a couple of other things. Henning Markard writes, "Good evening from Berlin." He has a question, and this is, I mean, it's a good question. How familiar is the audience with the process of electrotyping? And I think some of us probably are familiar with it, and others are probably not. So it is worth looking up and sort of reading through the process. And then D. Andrews has written, "Your wonderful talk has made me wonder, will explorations of the production of print lead to your reassessing the common distinction between Du Bois and Washington as two ends of the African-American cultural spectrum, especially regarding education?"
So I'll probably get to that tomorrow night. So I might I think what I'm going to say tomorrow night will give a larger sense of this. But my sense is that we've done an injustice to the landscape of this historical moment because we've been really obsessed with the binary of W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. And that's not to say that a lot of those polls are not accurate and historically backed up, but I think that's been, for instance, one of the reasons why of course we wouldn't take Tuskegee seriously as a center of Black print. Why would we, when all we've ever thought about is the way that Booker T. Washington is basically anti-literary, right? Anti-books. I mean, I think those are some of the that's some knowledge that has wrapped itself so tightly around. So for me, it's not about a reassessment of their perspectives on education, though I do think there are a lot of nuances. It is two things. One is that there are a lot of positives and negatives about what each of them did, nuances to what they did. But also, it just looks to me like an area that we need to look more carefully. In other words, we've kind of been content to go along with what we think we know, rather than to go back and revisit, and to go back and sort of rethink. So, I think for me, I think the story of HBCUs will help me to reassess what I know about Black education, because I feel like I think I know a lot, but when I get in there, I'm thoroughly confused by what I actually see. So I think it's just a matter of really looking more carefully at what, we think we know.
I just want to mention your final lecture will be on Thursday and not tomorrow for those who are on Zoom. And we will have an informal seminar tomorrow, Wednesday, from 10 to noon for anybody who can make it. Do we have any more questions from the floor?
I know that you're really invested in this period, but I am thinking about the lineage of Du Bois's idea, right? That it was so important to control the means of production, right? In order to have full range of expression. So you talked about cues a bit, but I'm thinking too about the Black arts movement and broadside press and third world press and the Black feminist movement and kitchen table press and that lineage, right, of the same idea. So I'm curious if you're at that moment of thinking about what you're working on as part of a tradition and whether you're rethinking that tradition.
So I think the tradition that I sort of can't seem to get away from is this idea of Black study that takes place not in the context of formal educational institutions, that takes place outside of, through different channels, through different means, and the way that African Americans kept returning to these modes of education, whether they were purposefully planned or however they came about, these modes of education that would reach not only those privileged enough to sit in the seats of educational institutions, be they ones like Penn or historically Black colleges or community, whatever they were. I mean, even that was privilege. So to think, for me, what I keep coming back to is these modes of publication, or these modes of education, and these means of publication that were outside of those channels. And I think that, I mean, I keep trying to keep myself from going too far into the 20th century, because I feel like everyone, just sort of creeps up, and suddenly the 19th century is just there by itself. But for me, that's the story that I keep coming back to. And that's why I mentioned last night the bronze booklets, Elaine Locke's bronze booklets. It's the same thing. It's the same interest in basically, however you call it, are they extension programs? Are they efforts to create, like Kelly Miller was saying, a library of Negro literature that would circulate outside of the formal institution of studying Negro literature? This idea that even as the university is forming, is taking shape, and academic disciplines are hardening, Black people are still looking for means of spreading that education outside. So yes, I think there's a huge trajectory there.
I have a question, Liz, which just got me thinking about the students who were engaged in learning the printing trades and have, trying to follow some of them to see what that trajectory is and see where they end up. I mean, I think that's the other side of it. If you're starting to work, and exploring what's happening there, trying to figure out who are some of these, were there women there? There seem to have been women in some of these, this shop that we see. I mean, but it would be interesting to think about some of them and who go. We know we've got a couple of them that go on to Du Bois's shop, and do we know what happens to them afterwards? But also to some of these other ones, do they end up staying and working in certain areas or certain shops? I mean, it's not an easy one. I'm not saying it is, but I think it's interesting to think about that too.
Yeah, well, the catalogs of all these schools, the schools are so relatively small that they list all the names of graduates for a long time. So you actually can take a name of a graduate and then, sort of trace out where they go. And so, for instance, on Thursday, I'll talk a little bit about Spelman College, which had one of the earliest programs in printing. So it was a surprise to me. And in fact, they were the Spelman program helped to set up the Atlanta University printing program. And the other thing I'll do is I'll talk about one printer from Tuskegee who goes on to start up another printing program at another school and then stays in the literary business, though not in the printing business. So, so I do think there are channels. And one of the most interesting things, I'm not going to talk about this on Thursday, I don't think. But one of the most interesting things that I've found is those, remember that Spelman was a seminary. And one of the things it seems to have done more than a lot of other schools is it produced missionaries. And by missionaries, I mean missionaries that went overseas. And so many of them then go overseas and start printing programs, printers, they carry printers with them. It is amazing to me. And part of what they do over there is that they not only teach students how to print, but they also go about printing, for instance, the Bible, less surprising, but they go about like for years and years, they are printing like one specific Bible. So it's really interesting to see the way that these printers traveled in this moment where, for instance, I mean, one of the things that Black women did after they came out of seminary is they went overseas as missionaries and lived these incredible lives for the era, like, that I think we know not that much about. But one of the big things that they took with them was the skill of printing. So I think you're absolutely right that following, I mean, as I was saying to Laura, it's like how many different ways, because that's going to be the story, is how the magic of it is how you piece it together, and how many different ways, and if you can then make it cohere. So a lot of different, if you can, maybe.
We'll see.
We'll see.
Well, with that, let's thank Elizabeth McHenry for another wonderful lecture.
Thank you.